Welcome to week 5 of the Music of the Rolling Stones, 1962 to 1974. This week, we're going to focus on the years 1969 into the first half of 1971, and the two big albums we're going to consider are Let It Bleed and Sticky Fingers. So coming out of Beggar's Banquet from last week and looking toward Exile on Main Street, which next week we'll spend the entire week looking at that big double album. So Let It Bleed and Sticky Fingers. This video will be an introduction to some of the big issues we'll talk about this week, and then kind of an overview of some of the things that happened in 1969. We'll talk about 1969 first, and the Let It Bleed album and the singles around it. Well, the first thing to say in terms of the overall structure of this week is that 1969 and 1970, even into 1971, bring some really important changes in the story of the Rolling Stones. Now, musically, I'll make an argument that there's a lot of continuity from the stuff that we were talking about last week. But in terms of personnel and things, there's a real kind of changing of the guard in some dimensions. First of all, inside the band itself, Brian Jones leaves the group in 1969 and is eventually replaced by Mick Taylor, first as kind of a sideman and then as a full-fledged member. We'll talk a little bit more about that story a little bit later. In 1970, Alan Klein is out as the guy sort of handling the financial end of what's going on with the Rolling Stones. And the deal with Decca, the one that Alan Klein negotiated for the Rolling Stones, that expires too. And so 1970s are real kind of a business, in terms of the business of the band, a real kind of a changing of the guard. And then in 1971, the first half of 1971, we see the band actually leaving the country, leaving the UK as tax exiles, because there's this big unpaid tax bill, and there's no way, given the tax bracket they were in, they could generate enough money to pay off their back taxes, so they had to leave the country in order to clear more money out of what they were making. So 69, 70, 71, lots of changes going on. But musically, the band continues in the more blues-based style that we talked about them developing in Beggar's Banquet. Now you can remember that one of the things I said is that while we get a really strong sense of a return to more of the sort of blues-based, blues rock kind of style in the Stones' music, we also can see the influence of so many of those other cover versions that they did earlier on, and we kind of tracked some of the influences of country and gospel, and of course blues, folk, people like Dylan, maybe people like the Beach Boys and the Beatles and the Stones music. So there's plenty of that going on. But also this idea that they turned their backs on psychedelia and all of the kind of artistic ambitions of psychedelia and the very sort of musically ambitious kinds of things doesn't really hold up either. We talked about that with regard to Beggar's Banquet, and that will continue to be the story with Let It Bleed and Sticky Fingers. But what's new during this period of the group is that there's a new dimension of musical ambition that starts to make its way into Rolling Stones music, and that's the dimension of musical virtuosity. Now, the group have always had players around them who were good musicians and good players in certain kinds of ways. I mean, all the guys in the group were pretty good musicians, but I mean, sort of professional studio musician types. Jack Nietzsche, for example, playing piano. Nicky Hopkins, we've already talked about him being a part of the group. But now, when Mick Taylor comes into the group, for the first time they get a guitar player who really is kind of a guitar player's guitar player, a musician's musician. And when somebody like that comes into the group, you got to give them a little bit of room to roam, musically speaking, which means that they're now going to come into the group kind of musical passages and things that are a little bit sort of more inspired by musicianly kinds of concerns rather than strictly arranging and songwriting concerns. So when you put together Mick Taylor with Nicky Hopkins, who's been involved in the recordings now, Jim Price, who comes in on the trumpet, Bobby Keys, who comes in on the saxophone, and Jack Nietzsche, who's around in some of these sessions, especially Let It Bleed. We really got a lot of really talented musicians working around the Rolling Stones, and that does make their music more musically ambitious from a technical musical point of view than anything we've seen up to that point. We'll get to that this week as we talk about it. I do want to say, though, about the musical end of it. It's important again to note that Brian Jones had been a gifted and versatile musician in the group. Brian had a real natural ability and a certain amount of skill built up as a guitarist and a harmonica player. But he was one of those kinds of guys, as I've said many times over the last couple of weeks, who could just kind of pick up any instrument, get a sound out of it right away. And so he was playing all kinds of different instruments. And that led to a kind of musical experimentation. But when you get a guy like Mick Taylor in the group, who really, is just a natural, and you put him together with somebody like Nicky Hopkins and Bobby Keys, all of a sudden something else starts to happen that hadn't happened in the Rolling Stones music up to this point. Well, let's take a look now at the calendar for 1969 and see some of the events that unfolded for the group. There was recording going on for the group during most of the year in chunks. They weren't recording continuously. There are a lot of other kinds of things going on. But from February through November, the group is working on recording. In the summer of 1969, they bring out the single Honky Tonk Women, backed with You Can't Always Get What You Want. That single goes to #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. Those are going to be part of a song close-up I'm going to do, so I'll save discussion of those songs for that point. Brian Jones is busted a second time for drugs. Remember, the story I told last week is that Brian tended to be really paranoid about these drug busts. So he's busted a second time. He crashes his motorcycle. It really just sort of looks like Brian Jones is in a real decline by May of 1969. And so in June of 1969, Brian leaves the band, and Mick Taylor eventually joins under the idea that Mick Taylor is going to do the touring that they have coming up in '69. Brian kind of didn't want to do the touring. He kind of didn't like the direction the group was going in now. And in some ways, he might have had visa problems because of the drug bust. Although Keith and Mick, that might have been a problem for them as well. Still, it seemed like an amicable parting of the ways. If you can imagine Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Charlie Watts going out to Brian's country home, a country home that had once been owned by A.A. Milne, the guy who wrote all those Winnie the Pooh stories. And them having this discussion with Brian. Keith Richards has said that he thought that Brian kind of knew this was coming. And Charlie Watts has said that he felt really bad about it because he felt like they were taking the most important thing in Brian's life away from him by having him leave the group. The deal they made with him is he was just leaving the group for current purposes because they were going to be finishing an album and touring, and he couldn't be part of it. But he could always come back to the group again. So he wasn't out for good. He was just out for now, and they were going to get this sideman, Mick Taylor, to come in to the group. Well, as I said before about Mick Taylor, a fantastic musician, had played with John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. So he was from that same kind of lineage that had brought us people like Eric Clapton and Peter Green, who was in that the first version of Fleetwood Mac. And so Mick Taylor was one of those kinds of sort of virtuoso blues guitar guys, sort of in the mold of Eric Clapton or Peter Green. Unfortunately, tragically really, Brian Jones dies just weeks after the announcement that he was out of the band in July of 1969, just about the time the Stones were going to play their first live gig in a while with Mick Taylor on guitar. A very awkward situation for the group. They decided to make it into a kind of a celebration of Brian's life, and Mick Jagger read some poetry at the concert, but no doubt a very, very difficult time for the group and a very, very awkward kind of concert. November, December '69, the group does its 6th U.S. tour. Now, when they're touring, remember they haven't been touring for a little bit. Now that when they're touring, the touring environment has changed very much from what it used to be. It used to be, remember, when the Stones would give a concert, maybe the set would last, 30 minutes, 35 minutes, if they ever got to the end of it. But a lot of times they never got to the end of it because some kind of a disturbance would break out and the police would have to shut it down. And we talked about all the context around all that. Well, now the concert business has changed by the time they get back into it again at the end of '69. Now people sit in their seats. Maybe they've done a little bit too much of substances, this kind of thing. But there's none of this kind of, fighting and rushing the stage and rioting. Now people expect a show. And not only do they expect a musical performance, but they can hear it now because sound systems have been built up and speakers and microphones and mixing and all of this kind of thing. And so the Stones are now confronted with a situation where when they used to play live gigs, nobody could really hear how they sounded because there was all that screaming and all that pandemonium. Now they were going to have to really deliver the goods live. They were going to have to get up there on stage, play the entire set, which was going to have to last, an hour and a half, maybe longer. Think about it. We're talking about 1969, so this is the same time when groups like the Grateful Dead and other groups like that were touring, and so these shows were bigger and an entirely new environment. So they were a little bit threatened by that. That's why it was so important that when they came through in '69, they be as good as they can be. While they were on that tour in the United States, they recorded at Muscle Shoals, a recording studio in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, which is a place that had really sort of had a rich history of recording R&B. People like Wilson Pickett, for example, had recorded in Muscle Shoals. Percy Sledge, When a Man Loves a Woman, was recorded down in Muscle Shoals. The first Aretha Franklin tracks were recorded down in Muscle Shoals, usually associated with the Southern soul style. And we know the Stones were very enamored of that. So they got a chance to go to Muscle Shoals, much as they'd gotten a chance to record at Chess Studios in Chicago earlier, the RCA Studios where Elvis had recorded in Los Angeles. Those tracks from the end of 1969 will appear on the Sticky Fingers LP. And then the album Let It Bleed is finally released in November of 1969 in the US, goes to number 3. In December of '69, goes to number 1 in the UK when it's released there in December. So these tragedies, let's spend a little bit more time talking about the tragedies that happened in 1969. The first one I think can be dispensed with fairly quickly. It certainly was a tragedy of Brian Jones' death. He was found dead at the bottom of his swimming pool. He'd been partying with a couple of friends. They went back into the house for a minute. He said he'd be there in a second. They went back in. They didn't see anything from him. Wonder what happened to Brian. They come out. There he is at the bottom of the pool, pretty much already gone. And so, the idea is that maybe he'd done a little bit too much partying, maybe too many substances, maybe he hit his head, who knows, but it was probably an accidental death, either by overdose or something, but it was surely by drowning. Well, then some stories started to come up that perhaps it was a murder. Somebody had done Brian in. And there was even a deathbed confession by somebody some years ago. I'm not even going to mention the person's name because it's not even credible, and I don't really want to give the person any more notoriety than that deserves. You can look it up and find out about it. But anyway, the theories of Brian's murder are generally thought not to be credible. It was just a tragic accident that caused him to lose his life. Maybe it was suicide, probably not. It was just the kind of thing that can happen sometimes when there's just too much drugs, too much alcohol, that kind of thing. The bigger tragedy, or not bigger, but the tragedy that loomed larger in the Stones' history during 1969 was the terrible incident that happened at the concert at the Altamont Speedway in the San Francisco area, December the 6th, 1969. The Stones, during that tour, had announced that they were going to be doing a concert when they were in New York, I think it was, at the beginning of the tour. We're going to do a free concert in Golden Gate Park with the Grateful Dead, having never really consulted with anybody about it. Mick Jagger kind of improvised it, figuring other people would work out the details. Well, when the people in San Francisco found out about it, the city fathers and that kind of thing, no, there's not going to be any of that kind of thing. So they looked around for a location, finally settled on this racetrack, the Altamont Speedway, to do the concert. And the concert was kind of during the same time in which a lot of these big concerts had happened. That summer, '69, Woodstock, remember, had happened, which included Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, Santana, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Jimi Hendrix had played at Woodstock. And so a lot of those groups were back again for this Altamont concert. not Hendrix. The security was provided by the Hells Angels. Well, in the UK, the Stones had done a show where the security was provided by Hells Angels in UK, and it seemed okay. You know, it was all right. But these guys in San Francisco, this was a different lot. They got drunk and they got angry and they started beating people up. They were beating people up, and members of the audience in front of the stage. And one of the members of the Jefferson Airplane, Marty Balin, was attacked by one of these Hells Angels. It was really bad news. And during one of the Rolling Stones numbers, a young fan by the name of Meredith Hunter was stabbed by a Hells Angel after brandishing a gun in front of the stage. Was stabbed in front of the Stones as they were in the middle of a performance, and it was all caught on film because they were filming a documentary at the time. And so when you take the Brian Jones death in the summer of '69 and this terrible incident in December of '69 and put them together, it just seems like a real year of tragedies for the Stones from that point of view. But amidst all of this tragedy and all of this bad stuff that was going on and these changes, they produced a fantastic album, released it at the end of 1969, and that album was Let It Bleed, and that's what we'll turn to in the next video.